5 minutes after the judge signed the final divorce decree, I was standing beside my old Chevy Silverado, helping my 14-year-old son, Ethan, buckle his seatbelt. The July heat in Columbus, Ohio, was heavy enough to make my shirt stick to my back. My left knee was aching again, the familiar dull pain I'd learned to ignore after 2 surgeries. Lucas, my 11-year-old, climbed into the back seat and shut the door. For a moment, nobody spoke. I got behind the wheel, but didn't start the truck. Then Lucas asked quietly, "Dad? Yeah? Are we still a family?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror. I'd spent the whole afternoon answering questions from lawyers and a judge, but somehow that was the question that left me without an answer. "We always will be," I said. Lucas nodded, although he didn't look convinced. I started the engine. The air conditioner rattled, the radio came on, and for a few seconds, everything sounded exactly as it had on countless ordinary drives. Except nothing was ordinary anymore. Rachel had walked out of the courthouse with the house, most of our savings, and a settlement my attorney, Daniel Hayes, had warned me would hurt. I expected anger. Instead, I mostly felt exhausted. 20 years of marriage had ended with a few signatures. I knew I hadn't been the husband I should have been. I owned a commercial refrigeration company, and for years I'd convinced myself that working hard was how a man took care of his family. The company paid our bills. It paid for vacations, school expenses, repairs, everything we needed. But there was always another job, another emergency, another customer who needed me. I missed school events. I arrived late to birthdays. I postponed family trips because something at work had gone wrong. I told myself I'd make up for it later. Later turned out to be a dangerous word. We drove north on Interstate 71. About 15 minutes into the drive, Ethan's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, then at me. "Dad." "What?" He held the phone toward me. "You should see this." I took it. It was a photograph from a family group chat. Rachel was sitting at a restaurant table with her parents. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and Derek Coleman, Derek, had been described to me for months as nothing more than a friend. Everyone in the picture was smiling. There were champagne glasses on the table. The caption said, "To new beginnings." I stared at the photograph. Lucas leaned forward from the back seat. "Is Mom with Derek?" Ethan immediately looked out the window. I put the phone down. "Your mother is making her own decisions right now." Lucas was quiet. I didn't know what else to say. About 20 minutes later, we stopped at a gas station. The boys went inside for drinks while I bought coffee. My phone rang just as I stepped outside. "Daniel, everything okay?" I asked. There was a pause. "Something happened," he said. I leaned against the brick wall beside the ice machine. "What happened? Do you remember Robert Mercer?" I straightened. "The trustee? Yeah. He contacted me." My grip tightened around the coffee cup. "Why?" "He says he's finally able to release information we've been waiting on." I looked across the parking lot. People were coming and going, as if nothing unusual was happening. "What kind of information?" Daniel lowered his voice. "It concerns Thomas Reed." I stopped breathing for a second. Thomas had been my business partner for almost 20 years before cancer took him. "What about him?" "There was a trust." "I know about the trust." "No," Daniel said. "You know part of it." I stared at the traffic moving beyond the gas station. "What aren't you telling me?" "I'm not hiding anything." "Robert only contacted me a few minutes ago. He says the legal restrictions are finally gone." I closed my eyes. For 7 months, I'd known there was something connected to Thomas that I didn't fully understand. Robert had told me to be patient. Daniel had told me not to make assumptions. So I'd waited. Now the waiting was apparently over. "When did Robert call you?" I asked. "About 10 minutes ago." I glanced through the gas station window. Ethan was arguing with Lucas about which drink to buy. For the first time all day, I almost smiled. "Does Rachel know?" "Not yet." I rubbed my forehead. "Whatever this is, Daniel, keep the boys out of it." "Of course." When I returned to the truck, Ethan handed me my coffee. "You look stressed," he said. "I'm having a great day." He gave me a doubtful look. Then Lucas climbed in, carrying 2 drinks, and announced that Ethan had picked the wrong flavor. Their argument started before I even pulled out of the parking lot. I let them argue. Their voices filled the truck, ordinary and familiar. And for a few minutes, I needed that, because 7 months earlier, before the divorce, before Derek became a name I couldn't stop hearing, before lawyers became part of my daily life, there had been a plain white envelope sitting on my kitchen counter. It didn't look important. No warning, no dramatic message, just an envelope with Rachel's name on it and a Columbus return address. I almost put it with the rest of the mail. Instead, I opened it. That one decision would eventually force me to question everything I thought I knew about my marriage. At the time, though, I had no idea what was waiting inside. The next morning, I woke up before 6. For a few seconds, I forgot about the divorce. Then I reached across the bed and touched an empty pillow. I lay there staring at the ceiling. The house was too quiet. I had spent 20 years waking up beside Rachel. Even during the worst months of our marriage, knowing someone else was in the room had become part of the background of my life. Now, there was only the hum of the air conditioner. I got dressed and went downstairs. Ethan was already in the kitchen. "You're up early," I said. "So are you." I couldn't sleep. He opened the refrigerator. "There's no milk. I'll get some." He closed the door and looked at me. "Dad? Yeah? Are you going to lose the house?" I hesitated. "The house is part of the divorce settlement." "So yes?" "Yeah." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I like that house. That hurt more than I expected." "So did I." He grabbed his backpack. "I'll see you later." After he left, I stood in the kitchen for several minutes. That house had never been particularly special. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a small backyard, and a kitchen where the cabinets were already starting to peel around the edges. But it held 20 years of memories. Christmas mornings, broken appliances, arguments over homework, Lucas learning to ride a bicycle in the driveway, Rachel laughing so hard one Thanksgiving that she nearly dropped a pie. I wasn't ready to let those memories become evidence of a life that had failed. At 8:30, Daniel called. "Robert wants to meet today." "Today?" "He says it's important." "Where?" "His office downtown." I agreed. Before leaving, I stopped by the kitchen counter. That was where the envelope had been. 7 months earlier. I hadn't thought about it for weeks. Now I couldn't stop. The first time I opened it, I had found a financial statement from an investment company in Columbus. The account wasn't in my name. It wasn't a joint account. It belonged to Rachel. There was just over $28,000 in it. That amount alone hadn't scared me. The secrecy had. When I asked Rachel about it that evening, she had been washing dishes. "What's the Columbus account?" I asked. She stopped moving. "What account?" "The investment statement." She dried her hands slowly. "It's nothing." I remember looking at her. "Then why didn't I know about it?" She shrugged. "Because it's mine." That answer bothered me. Not because married people can't have private accounts. They can. But 20 years together had created a different expectation between us. I let the subject go. 2 weeks later, I found another statement, then another. The amounts weren't huge, but money was moving between accounts in ways I couldn't explain. That's when I called Frank Dalton. Frank was 63, a retired IRS investigator who had become a forensic accountant after leaving government work. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't make accusations without paperwork. We met at a diner off Route 28. He looked over everything quietly. Then he pushed the papers back toward me. "There's a pattern." "What kind?" "Transfers." "To where?" "Different places." He tapped one line with his finger. "Some of these payments connect to businesses associated with Derek Coleman." I stared at the name. "Derek?" Frank nodded. "Do you know what he does?" "Property development, I think." "You think?" "I've never paid much attention." Frank gave me a look. "That's part of the problem." I didn't appreciate hearing that. but I couldn't argue. I had spent years assuming Rachel handled certain things because she enjoyed it more than I did. Bills, investments, household accounts. I trusted her, maybe too much. Frank continued. Derek's companies have serious cash flow problems. How serious? He's behind on several loans. I leaned back. So Rachel is helping him. I didn't say that. You just showed me money moving toward his businesses. I'm showing you transactions. You decide what they mean. That distinction stayed with me. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Rachel, about the woman I had married, about the woman who used to leave notes in my lunch bag when I worked overnight jobs, about the woman who once drove 3 hours through a snowstorm because my truck broke down. It was easier to be angry when I remembered the recent years. It was much harder when I remembered the good ones. That evening, Rachel came home late. She walked into the kitchen and saw me sitting at the table. You're still awake. Yeah, she put her purse down. Everything okay? I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, who is Derek to you? She went completely still. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she looked away. He's a friend. Just a friend. She picked up her purse again. I don't want to do this tonight. Neither do I. She walked toward the stairs, then stopped. Michael, you haven't been happy for a long time. I looked at her. That doesn't answer my question. No, she said quietly. It doesn't. Then she went upstairs. I stayed at the table. For the first time, I realized the problem wasn't just money. Something between us had already changed. I just hadn't been willing to admit it. The next morning, Rachel left before I woke up. I knew because I heard the front door, close around 6:30. I stayed in bed for another 10 minutes, staring at the ceiling and wondering whether I should have pushed harder the night before. Part of me wanted answers. Another part was afraid of them. That was the strange thing about suspicion. You could spend days convincing yourself you wanted the truth, then suddenly find yourself hoping the truth wasn't what you thought it was. I got up and made coffee. At the kitchen table, I opened the folder Frank had given me. There were copies of bank transfers, company records, loan documents, and notes about Derek's businesses. I wasn't looking for an affair anymore. I was trying to understand why money from my household was connected to a man whose companies were struggling. One transfer caught my attention. It wasn't from Rachel's account. It came from a joint investment we'd opened years earlier for the boys. I stared at the page. That can't be right. I called Frank. He answered on the 4th ring. Morning. Frank, I found something. What? I told him. There was silence. Don't move anything, he said. Why? Because I need to verify it. How? I'll call you back. He hung up. I sat there for nearly an hour. When he finally called, his voice was different. Michael, that transfer was authorized by Rachel. I closed my eyes. How much? $24,000. That money had been set aside for Ethan and Lucas. School expenses, college savings, things we'd talked about for years. I felt angry then, not explosive anger. The quieter kind that makes you sit completely still because you don't trust yourself to speak. Where did it go? Derek's company. I looked at the wall. Why would she do that? I don't know. I almost called Rachel. Instead, I waited. When she came home that evening, she looked exhausted. She dropped her keys into the bowl beside the door. You're quiet. I found something. She looked at me. What? The boys' investment account. Her face changed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. $24,000 was transferred to Derek's company. Rachel sat down. For several seconds, she just stared at her hands. Michael. Why? He needed help. I laughed once, but there wasn't anything funny about it. You took money meant for our children. I was going to replace it. When? I don't know. That answer hurt more than I expected. Does Derek know where the money came from? Yes. I looked away. Rachel wiped her eyes. He told me he'd pay everything back. You believed him? Yes. Why? She didn't answer. I waited, finally, she said, because he made me feel like I mattered. I looked at her. I knew what she meant. I didn't like it, but I understood. For years, I'd been coming home tired, talking about work, checking my phone during dinner, and promising that things would slow down eventually. Derek had apparently listened. That didn't excuse what she had done, but it explained part of it. "I should have told you," she said. "Yes, I was embarrassed. Rachel, you didn't just hide money from me. I know, you used the boys' savings." She looked down. "I know." That was the first time I saw her cry. Not dramatic crying. She just covered her face with both hands and sat there. I wanted to comfort her. That was the problem. Even after everything, some part of me still wanted to protect her from pain. I moved my chair back, then stopped. I couldn't keep rescuing someone from consequences that belonged to them. "I need you to understand something," I said. She looked up. "I don't know if our marriage can survive this." She nodded slowly. "I don't think it can." The words sat between us. Neither of us argued. 3 days later, Rachel told me she wanted a divorce. There was no screaming, no slammed doors. She simply sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I think we've been pretending for too long." I asked her if Derek was the reason. She looked down. "He's part of it." That answer was enough. The divorce process started the following week. But while the lawyers were preparing paperwork, Frank kept investigating. And then he called me with something I hadn't expected. "Michael, I found the connection between Derek and your old business partner." I sat down. "What connection?" "Thomas Reed." My throat tightened. Thomas had been my closest friend and business partner for nearly 2 decades. He had died believing I'd always be able to run the company without him. Frank continued. "There are documents from years ago that nobody appears to have reviewed." "What kind of documents?" "A trust." I thought about the conversation I'd had with Robert Mercer months earlier. "The trustee?" "Yes." Frank paused. "You should meet with Robert before you make any decisions about the divorce." I looked at the divorce papers, sitting on my desk. "What does the trust have to do with Rachel?" "I don't know yet." That was the problem. Neither did I. The following morning, Robert Mercer called me himself. His first words were simple. "Michael, Thomas left something behind that you were never supposed to know about until now." I gripped the phone. "What did he leave?" Robert took a breath. "Something that may change what happens after your divorce." I met Robert Mercer the following afternoon in a small office downtown. He was 72, neatly dressed, and carried a leather briefcase that looked older than I was. He shook my hand. "Michael, Robert." We sat across from each other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he opened the briefcase. "I need to explain something before I show you these documents." "Okay." "Thomas asked me to keep this information confidential until certain legal conditions were met." "Because of the divorce?" He nodded. I leaned back. "Why didn't he tell me about the trust when he was alive?" Robert gave me a tired smile. "Because he didn't expect you to need it." That answer stayed with me. He pulled out several documents. I recognized Thomas's signature immediately. Seeing it made my chest tighten. Thomas had been more than a business partner. He was the man who helped me buy my first service truck when I couldn't get financing. He'd stood beside me when the company nearly failed during a bad winter. And now, years after his death, he was somehow sitting across the table from me again, through paperwork. Robert explained that Thomas had established a trust connected to several business interests. Over time, those interests had become considerably more valuable. I stared at him. "How valuable?" "Enough that you should let your attorney review everything before making assumptions." That was Robert's way of saying a lot without giving me a number. I understood. "What does Rachel have to do with it?" "Nothing directly." I frowned. "Then why did you wait until the divorce was almost finished?" "Because your marital status affected how the assets could be handled." I sat quietly. Suddenly the timing made sense. If I had received the information months earlier, the trust could have become part of the divorce negotiations, Robert continued. Thomas was very specific. He wanted you protected, but he didn't want this to become a weapon against anyone. I looked down at the documents. That sounded exactly like Thomas. He had always hated unnecessary conflict. Did he know Rachel? Of course. I nodded. Then he probably knew we weren't doing well. Robert didn't answer. He didn't need to. I drove home with a folder on the passenger seat. For the first time in months, I had information that could change my financial future, and yet I didn't feel victorious. I felt uncomfortable, because Rachel and I had spent months fighting over money, while I had been sitting on something neither of us fully understood. The divorce hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During those weeks, I kept my mouth shut. That wasn't easy. Rachel asked questions. Her attorney asked questions. Daniel told me to remain patient, so I did. Meanwhile, Derek's situation continued getting worse. Frank found more unpaid loans. Another development project had stalled. Several investors were demanding their money. The picture became clearer every week. Derek wasn't the successful businessman Rachel believed he was. He was borrowing from one person to cover another obligation. And Rachel had been helping him without understanding how deep the problem went. One evening, Ethan found me sitting in the garage. "You're thinking again," I smiled. "Apparently, that's what I do now." He sat beside me. For a while, we listened to the rain hitting the garage roof. Then he asked, "Are you scared?" I looked at him. "Yeah." "About Mom?" I shook my head. "About starting over." He was quiet, then he said, "You always tell us not to quit when things get hard." I laughed softly. "Do I?" "All the time." Sounds like something I'd say. "It is." He smiled. I looked at my son and realized something. I had spent months worrying about what I was losing. I hadn't spent enough time thinking about what I still had. The boys were still here. My company was still standing. I still had friends who called. I still had a chance to become a better father than I'd been. The final hearing came on a Tuesday morning. Rachel looked composed. I didn't. My knee hurt, I hadn't slept well, and I kept rubbing my thumb against the edge of my wedding ring. When the judge signed the decree, I took the ring off. I didn't throw it away. I put it in my pocket. Outside the courthouse, Rachel walked toward her car. We stopped for a moment. "I hope you're okay," she said. I nodded. "I hope you are too." Neither of us hugged. It would have felt dishonest. Then we went our separate ways. I thought that was the end. It wasn't. 5 minutes later, while I was helping Lucas into the truck, Daniel called. Robert contacted me. I already knew something was coming. What did he say? "The trust is officially active." I looked toward the courthouse. "And?" Daniel paused. "There's another problem." "What kind?" "It concerns Derek." I tightened my grip on the phone. "What happened?" Robert found evidence that Derek has been using borrowed money to maintain the appearance of success. I looked through the windshield at my 2 sons. Then Daniel said something that made me sit completely still. "Some of that money came through Rachel." I closed my eyes. The divorce was over. But apparently, the consequences were just beginning. Daniel's warning stayed with me all the way home. I didn't tell the boys what he'd said. They had already watched enough adults make decisions they didn't understand. That evening, I made spaghetti because it was the only meal I could prepare without thinking too much. Lucas complained that there wasn't enough cheese. Ethan told him he was being dramatic. For 10 minutes, they sounded like ordinary brothers again. I needed that. The next morning, Daniel sent me copies of the documents Robert had provided. I read them slowly. Derek had borrowed money from several people, including Rachel. Some transfers had gone directly into his business accounts. Others had covered personal expenses. There was no single document proving some elaborate scheme. It was messier than that. Derek had been struggling financially and kept convincing people that the next property deal would fix everything. Rachel had believed him. She had also made choices that were hers alone. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't going to blame Derek for every decision she had made. A week later, Rachel called. "Can we meet? About what?" "Everything." I agreed. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. She looked tired. For a while, neither of us touched our drinks. Then she said, "Derek lied to me." "I know. I thought he had one bad project." "He had several." She nodded. "I know that now." I watched her turn the coffee cup between her hands. "Why didn't you tell me about the money?" I was ashamed. "That doesn't make it okay." "I know." She looked at me. "I kept thinking I could fix it before you noticed." I almost smiled. "That sounds familiar." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "I spent 20 years telling myself I'd fix my absence at home later." She looked down. "That isn't the same thing." "No, it isn't." I took a breath. But we both kept postponing consequences. She didn't argue. After a minute, she said, "I'm sorry. I believed that she meant it. That didn't mean everything was forgiven." "I don't hate you, Rachel," I said, "but I can't keep protecting you from the results of your decisions." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect you to." That was probably the most honest conversation we'd had in years. There was no shouting, no dramatic apology. Just two people admitting that they'd both made choices that had damaged something they once cared about. A few days later, Derek disappeared. His office closed. His phone went unanswered. Rachel called me twice, asking if I'd heard from him. I hadn't. Frank later told me several investors were trying to locate him. Nobody knew where he'd gone. I didn't celebrate. I had imagined revenge many times during the worst months of the divorce. But watching another person's life fall apart wasn't satisfying. It was simply sad. Meanwhile, Robert and Daniel helped me sort through Thomas's trust. The money was real, but it wasn't some magical fortune that solved everything. There were restrictions, taxes, legal fees, and decisions I needed to make carefully. I used part of it to secure a modest home for myself and the boys. Nothing fancy. Just enough room for all three of us to start again. I also put money aside for Ethan and Lucas. That mattered more to me than anything else. A month after the divorce, Rachel came to the house to pick up some of her remaining belongings. She stopped in the hallway when she saw an old family photographs. It was from a beach trip years earlier. All four of us were standing in the sand. Lucas was missing one front tooth. Ethan was holding a plastic shovel. Rachel and I were laughing. She touched the frame. "I remember that day." "So do I." "We were happy." "We were." She looked at me. "Do you think we could ever be friends?" I thought about it. "Maybe." She nodded. "That's fair." She picked up her boxes and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned around. "Michael?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for not making the boys choose sides." I swallowed. They shouldn't have to. She nodded and left. I closed the door behind her. The house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel empty. Upstairs, Lucas was arguing with Ethan about a video game. I heard Ethan yell, "Dad?" I smiled. "What?" Lucas cheated. I did not. I walked toward the stairs. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about Rachel, Derek, the divorce, or the money. I was thinking about dinner and homework, and whether we had enough milk for breakfast. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was still a life. And maybe that was the part I had forgotten. The first few months after the divorce were harder than I expected. Not because of the money, not because Derek disappeared. It was the ordinary things that caught me off guard. Saturday mornings used to mean 4 people in the kitchen. Now there were 3. There were still 2 toothbrushes missing from the bathroom cabinet, an empty space in the closet where Rachel's clothes had been, and a stack of old photographs I couldn't bring myself to put away. I didn't try to erase 20 years. That would have been dishonest. Instead, I learned how to live around what was left. Ethan started helping me with groceries. Lucas became responsible for making sure we didn't run out of cereal, which he took far more seriously than necessary. My knee slowly improved. I reduced my hours at the company and trusted my managers with more responsibility. For years, I had believed stepping away from work meant losing control. It turned out I had simply been afraid to let other people prove they could handle things. About 6 months after the divorce, Rachel asked if we could have dinner together with the boys. I almost said no. Then I thought about Ethan and Lucas. They deserved to see their parents sitting at the same table without tension filling every silence, so I agreed. Dinner was awkward at first. Lucas talked about school. Ethan complained about a teacher. Rachel laughed at something he said. I noticed myself smiling too. For a moment, it felt almost normal. Then Rachel looked at me. I've been thinking about something. I waited. I spent a long time blaming you for everything that went wrong. I didn't interrupt, she continued. You weren't perfect. I know, but I wasn't either. I nodded. That was enough. We didn't need to rewrite the past. We couldn't. Derek eventually resurfaced in another state. From what I heard, several of his business relationships had ended badly. Some debts were settled. Others took years. I never contacted him. I didn't need to. Whatever happened to him wasn't my responsibility. The trust Thomas had created changed my financial future. But it didn't change who I was. I still drove the same truck. I still complained about grocery prices. I still called Ethan when I needed help figuring out something on my phone. And I still had to remind Lucas to turn off the bathroom light. One Sunday afternoon, almost 2 years after the divorce, the boys and I went fishing at East Fork State Park. We sat near the water as the sun began to disappear behind the trees. We hadn't caught much. Lucas had complained about the bait. Ethan had spent half the afternoon on his phone. It was perfect. After a while, Ethan looked at me. You seem happier. I looked at the lake. I think I am. Even after everything? I nodded, because of everything. He didn't respond. Neither did I. I thought about the envelope on the kitchen counter, the hidden accounts, the arguments, the courthouse, the photograph with the champagne glasses, the trust Thomas had left behind. None of it had happened the way I once imagined. For months, I had wanted somebody to lose. I wanted Rachel to understand what she'd done. I wanted Derek exposed. I wanted people to know that I hadn't been the villain they thought I was. But eventually, I realized that proving I was right wouldn't repair my life. Taking responsibility for my own mistakes did more for me than revenge ever could. I had failed Rachel in some ways. She had hurt me in others. Neither fact erased the other. And my sons didn't need a perfect father. They needed one who stayed. That was the promise I could actually keep. As the sun disappeared, Lucas packed away the fishing gear. Dad? Yeah? Are we still a family? I looked at him. It was the same question he'd asked outside the courthouse nearly 2 years earlier. This time I knew exactly what to say. We always were. He smiled. Ethan shook his head. You've been waiting 2 years to use that answer, haven't you? I laughed. Maybe. We walked back toward the truck together. My knee hurt a little. The truck still made that annoying rattling sound. Tomorrow there would be bills, work, and probably another argument about cereal. But for the first time in a long time, none of that scared me. I had spent years believing a family stayed together because everyone stayed under one roof. I don't believe that anymore. Sometimes people leave. Sometimes trust breaks. Sometimes the life you planned ends before you're ready. But love can survive in a different form. And sometimes starting over isn't about getting back what you lost. It's about finally noticing what you still have.